Let me begin by saying that I recently watched Spider-Man Brand New Day. To be completely honest, I never intended to watch it. Someone gave me free tickets, and since I had nothing particularly important planned for that evening, I decided to go. Now, during the first hour of the movie, I found myself somewhat disconnected from it. Like many superhero films, it felt highly unrealistic, almost excessively so. Sitting there in the cinema in London, surrounded by children who were completely absorbed in what they were seeing, I couldn't help but think about how these movies affect our imagination. Of course, that is a part of their purpose. Superhero stories are designed to make us dream. They invite us into worlds where impossible things become possible. But as adults, we often watch these movies differently. We are not simply looking at the action sequences or the special effects. We are trying to understand what lies beneath them. And that is precisely why I want to talk about this movie. Because despite my initial skepticism, despite feeling that the first hour was almost too fantastical, the film gradually became something far more interesting than I expected. What struck me most was not the action, it was not Spider-Man, and it was not even the visual spectacle. What fascinated me was the question that slowly emerged throughout the film. Who is actually the villain? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Many people will immediately point to Jean Grey, played by Sadie Sink. She arrives unexpectedly and quickly becomes one of the central figures of the story. Her presence disrupts the existing order, challenges the established authority, and creates tension throughout the narrative. Naturally, this leads many viewers to assume that she is the antagonist, but after watching the entire movie, I found myself asking a very different question. Is Jean Grey truly the villain? Or is she simply the character who exposes something that was already wrong from the beginning? That question is what transformed this movie from a typical superhero film into something much more philosophical, and perhaps even political. Now, when I say political, I do not necessarily mean political in the modern partisan sense. I'm not talking about political parties or election campaigns. What I mean is that the movie begins to ask questions about authority, loyalty, power, and trust. Questions that have occupied philosophers, historians, and political thinkers for centuries. In many ways, this reminded me of something that existed long before cinema. The ancient theaters of Greece and Rome. When we think about ancient theater, we often imagine it as a form of entertainment. And certainly it was, but it was also something much more important. It was a place where ideas could be discussed in public, a place where difficult truths can be explored through stories. Ancient playwrights understood something very important. Sometimes an idea is too dangerous to be stated directly. Sometimes a criticism of power becomes easier to communicate when it is disguised as entertainment. Present the audience with a story. Give them heroes and villains. Give them drama and conflict. And while they are focused on the story, allow a deeper message to enter their minds. This is why many of the greatest works of theater have survived for thousands of years. Because beneath the entertainment, they were asking questions about human nature. In a strange way, I think modern superhero films sometimes perform a similar function. I know that many sound like an exaggeration. After all, Marvel movies are generally viewed as blockbuster entertainment. Many of them are designed primarily for younger audiences, but that does not mean they are empty. In fact, some of the most popular stories throughout history have carried philosophical ideas beneath their surface. Children may watch them for the adventure. Adults may watch them for entirely different reasons. A child sees Spider-Man fighting villains. An adult may see a story about responsibility, sacrifice, power, and isolation. The same story can operate on multiple levels simultaneously. And that is why I believe these films are often worth discussing. Not because every detail is profound, not because every scene contains hidden meaning, but because occasionally a film presents an idea that deserves closer attention. And for me, Spider-Man Brand New Day does exactly that. The moment Jean Grey enters the story, the movie begins to shift. Focus is no longer simply on heroes and villains. Instead, it becomes a question of perspective. Who is telling the truth? Who benefits from current system? Who decides what is right and what is wrong? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when someone begins to question the very institutions they once trusted? These questions become increasingly important as the movie progresses because Jean Grey is not presented as evil in the traditional sense. She is not motivated by conquest. She is not trying to destroy the world. She is not seeking chaos for its own sake or of any kind. Instead, she functions almost like a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths back at the people around her. And this is where the movie become genuinely interesting to me, because throughout history, people who challenge established systems are often viewed as dangerous. Not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they focus others to confront questions they would rather avoid. The more I watched Jean Grey's character develop, the less she resembled a conventional villain. And that is where the real conflict of the movie begins. Not between Spider-Man and Jean Grey, but between loyalty and truth, between trust and power, between the individual and the institution. And it is the conflict that forms the foundation of everything else I want to discuss. Because once the movie begins asking those questions, it becomes impossible to look at the Department of Damage Control in the same way. And that is where the story becomes far more complicated than it first appears. What truly changed my opinion of the movie was not one particular action scene or one spectacular visual effect. It was a conversation. It was the dialogue that Jean Grey has with Spider-Man, because it completely changed the way I understood the story. There's one idea that she expresses that, at least for me, becomes the philosophical center of the film. I'm paraphrasing here, but the meaning remains the same. She tells Spider-Man something along these lines. The government for whom we work, the institution we dedicate our lives to, and the people whose laws we faithfully follow never completely trust those who serve them. Even while you are risking your life for them, they are already preparing for the possibility that one day you may stand against them. The moment your loyalty changes or even appears to change, they already have a plan to destroy you. That single idea stayed with me long after the movie ended. Whether one agrees with it or not is another matter. What interests me is not whether it is literally true in every situation. What interests me is the question it raises. Can an institution ever truly trust an individual, or does every institution ultimately exist to preserve itself before it preserves the people who serve it? This is where the Department of Damage Control becomes so important in the film. Throughout the movie, Spider-Man believes that he is working alongside people who respect him. He believes they are allies. He believes they value his sacrifices. But Jean Grey reveals something that completely changes this perspective. Behind the scenes, the department has already prepared countless measures against him. They already know how to stop him. They already know how to imprison him. They already know how to eliminate him if necessary. Think about that for a moment. Spider-Man is risking his life every single day for the safety of others. Yet the very people who benefit from his sacrifices have also prepared for the day they might have to destroy him. That is not merely an action movie twist. It is a philosophical statement about power. Power rarely depends upon trust alone. Power depends upon preparation. Those who hold authority cannot afford to rely entirely upon loyalty. Instead, they constantly prepare for betrayal, even from those who have never betrayed them. This creates an uncomfortable paradox. The better you serve the institution, the more value you become. Exactly the same time, the more dangerous you become. Because if someone as capable as Spider-Man ever decides to oppose the system, he would become against its greatest threat. So the institution prepares for both possibilities simultaneously. It rewards him and it fears him. That contradiction is fascinating. And perhaps it extends far beyond superhero movies. Throughout history, we find similar patterns. Soldiers who faithfully served governments were abandoned after wars ended. Political adversaries who once stood beside powerful leaders suddenly become enemies. Scientists, thinkers, philosophers, oh my goodness, and even military commanders have often been celebrated while they were useful and forgotten or condemned once they were no longer convenient. Again, I am not saying that every institution behaves this way, nor am I think the movie is making such an absolute claim, but rather I think it is inviting us to consider a possibility. Perhaps loyalty inside institutions is often conditional. Perhaps we mistake usefulness for genuine appreciation. That distinction is extremely important. Someone may appreciate your abilities, someone may depend upon your work, but none of those things necessarily mean they value you as a person. Sometimes they simply value what you are able to provide. And these are two entirely different things. This, I believe, is one of the deepest psychological observations in the film. As human beings, we naturally want to believe that those around us genuinely care for us. We want to believe that the people we sacrifice for will also sacrifice for us. Trust always allows society to function. Without trust, friendships become impossible. Families begin to fall apart. Communities disappear. But trust also makes us vulnerable. The people capable of hurting us the most are usually those whom we trusted the most. Not strangers, not enemies, but those we believed were standing beside us. That is why a betrayal hurts so deeply. A betrayal is not simply the breaking of an agreement. It is the collapse of a picture we carried in our minds about another person. The movie captures this remarkably well through Spider-Man. He never expected that the people working alongside him while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of fighting against him. And perhaps this is why Jean Grey never feels like a conventional villain. She does not create the betrayal. She reveals it. That is a significant difference. Truth often appears dangerous because it destroys comfortable illusions. History gives us countless examples. The individual who reveals corruption is often treated as criminal. The individual who exposes hypocrisy becomes the problem, not because they created the injustice, but because they forced everyone else to look at the problem, the thing. This is why I find Jean Grey such an interesting character. She almost functions like the ancient philosopher Socrates. Socrates never claimed to possess all the answers. Instead, he asked uncomfortable questions that forced people to examine beliefs they had never previously questioned. Jean Grey performs something very similar. She forces Spider-Man to question the institution that shaped his understanding of justice. She asks him to reconsider where his loyalty truly belongs. Should loyalty belong to an organization, to a government, to an institution, or should it belong first to one's own conscience? That, I think, is one of the central questions the movie quietly asks beneath all the explosions and action scenes. And once that question has entered our minds, the rest of the movie begins to look very different. The supposed conflict between hero and villain gradually transforms into something much more profound. Between obedience and independent judgment, between institutional power and personal authenticity. And this is where the movie, at least for me, becomes far more than another Marvel movie. It becomes a mediation on what it means to remain true to oneself while living inside systems that constantly asks for our loyalty. The difficult question, however, is this: can we ever completely give ourselves to another person or to an institution without risking the loss of our own authenticity? That question, I believe, leads us to the deepest philosophical part of the film, and that is where I want to go next. This brings me to what I think is the deepest philosophical question raised by the movie. If it is true that institutions can abandon us, if it is true that power often values usefulness more than loyalty, and if it is true that betrayal is always a possibility, then where does our authentic self actually exist? This is not simply a political question. It is a deeply human one. Every one of us belongs to something larger than ourselves. We belong to families. We belong to friendships. We belong to universities. We belong to workplaces. We belong to organizations. Sometimes we even belong to political movements or ideological communities. There is nothing wrong with belonging. In fact, human begins sought community because we cannot live completely alone. But belonging always comes with a danger. The danger is that we slowly begin to confuse ourselves with the institution we serve. We begin to believe that our identity is entirely defined by the organization, the cause, or the people around us. And when the institution changes its attitude toward us, we suddenly feel as though we have lost ourselves. This is why I think the movie is ultimately about authenticity. Jean Grey is not merely exposing the Department of Damage Control. She is forcing Spider-Man to ask a much deeper question. Who are you when nobody tells you who you are? That question is terrifying because many of us spend years trying to become the person that others expect us to be. We become the perfect employee, the loyal friend, the ideal student, the faithful citizen. But none of these things are bad, and they become dangerous when our entire identity depends upon the approval of others. The moment that approval disappears, we begin to wonder whether we ever knew ourselves at all. This reminded me of something that philosophers have discussed for centuries. Although I do not think the movies presenting Immanuel Kant directly, I was reminded of one of his central ideas. Kant argued that people should never be treated merely as a means to an end. Every individual possesses dignity and should always be regarded as an end in themselves. Yet how often does the world actually function like that? That is really an important question. How often are people valued simply because they are human? Far more often, we are valued because we are useful, because we are productive, because we possess a certain talent, because we can solve a problem, because we help someone else remain successful. This is exactly the concern that I saw reflected in Jean Grey's warning. She is not simply saying that governments are evil, nor do I think the movie is making such a simplistic argument. Rather, she suggests something much more subtle. Power has a tendency to preserve itself. That tendency exists in governments. It exists in corporations. It exists in organizations. Sometimes it even exists within families. Whenever power becomes the highest priority, individuals slowly become secondary. And that is precisely why authenticity becomes so important. Because if we lose ourselves while serving others, then eventually we possess nothing that truly belongs to us. But there is another fascinating aspect of Jean Grey's character, her psychic abilities. Unlike most characters, she possesses the extraordinary ability what's happening to enter the minds of other people. For those unfamiliar with her character, this ability may simply appear to be another superhero power. But symbolically, I think it represents something much more profound. Imagine for a moment that you could actually enter another person's mind. Imagine seeing not only what they say, but why they say it. Imagine understanding every hidden motive, every concealed fear, every unspoken desire. How differently would you understand the world? How differently would you judge other people? Most of us never truly know what another person is thinking. We interpret behavior, we interpret language, we interpret facial expressions, but we never have direct access to another person's mind. But here's the point, Jean Grey does. That character is awesome. That changes everything. It allows her to see beyond appearances. It allows her to distinguish genuine concern from calculated manipulation. It allows her to recognize motives that remain invisible to everyone else. Whether this is literally possible or not, the point is symbolic. Jean Grey becomes the one character capable of seeing through illusion. Perhaps that is why she understands the Department of Damage Control long before Spider-Man does. She recognizes that institutions often speak one language publicly while thinking another language privately. Again, this does not mean every institution is corrupt. It simply reminds us that appearances should never be accepted without question. Another moment that fascinated me was how both Spider-Man and Jean Grey eventually discover parts of themselves that neither they nor the department had fully recognized, almost as though each of them possessed another self, an alter ego, not simply in the comic book sense, but psychologically. There is always more within us than we ourselves realize. Human beings possess hidden strengths, hidden courage, hidden resilience. Often we discover these qualities only when circumstances force us to. The department believed it understood both of them completely. It believed everything could be predicted, everything could be controlled, everything could be contained. But human beings rarely remain confined within the categories others create for them. There is always something unexpected, something unpredictable, something that refuses to fit neatly inside another person's expectations. Perhaps this is why military strategists throughout history have often advised never revealing your full strength, your full potential. Not because deception is always desirable, but because your greatest strength is often the one nobody expects. Likewise, our greatest potential often remains hidden even from ourselves. Failure does not define us. Defeat does not exhaust us. There are always possibilities within us waiting to emerge. That, for me, personally, was one of the most powerful ideas in the entire movie. It suggests that identity is never fixed. We are always becoming. That's the important thing. We are always capable of changing. We are always capable of discovering something new about ourselves. So what then is the conclusion if someone wants to ask me? I know many people will watch this movie simply as another Marvel adventure. There is absolutely nothing wrong in that. Entertainment is valuable in its own right, but I also think stories become richer when we ask difficult questions, when we refuse to stop at the surface, when we allow ourselves to interpret them. For me, the central message of Spider-Man Brand New Day is this: evil is not always where we are told it exists. Sometimes it hides within the very systems that claim to protect us. Sometimes those who appear dangerous are simply revealing truths that others would rather ignore. And perhaps the greatest danger is not an obvious villain at all. Perhaps it is the gradual surrender of our own authenticity in exchange for acceptance, security, or approval. Finally, I think the movie reminds us of something deeply important. Never allow another person, another institution, or another ideology to define the limits of who you are. There will always be more within you than the world expects. There will always be strengths that have not yet been discovered. There will always be possibilities waiting to emerge. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Spider-Man. Not that heroes wear masks, but that every human being carries within them possibilities that no system can completely predict or control. Anyway, these are simply my thoughts after watching the film. I know many of you may completely disagree with my interpretation or what the fuck I am really talking about here. He went to entertain himself, but what he did to himself. Before you say this about me, that is perfectly fine. One of the beautiful things about cinema is that every viewer walks away with a different understanding. A movie is never only what the director intended, it is also what the audience discovers within it. So let me know what you think. Was Jean Grey really the antagonist, or was she the only character willing to confront a truth that everyone else preferred to ignore? I would genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys looking beyond the surface of films. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you in the next one. Bye.